Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Kenneth Walls, who was the Ford Professor of Political Science at Berkeley. He also taught at Swarthmore and Brandeis, and now is Adjunct Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. Professor Waltz is a former president of the American Political Science Association and a recipient of its James Madison Award for distinguished scholarly contributions to political science. He's the author of numerous books, including Man, the State and War, Theory of International Politics, Foreign Policy and Democratic Politics, and co-author with Scott Sagan of The Spread of Nuclear Weapons. Ken, welcome back to Berkeley.
Nice to be back.
Where were you born and raised?
Ann Arbor, Michigan.
And
went through high school there.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Not very much. My father never went to high school, and my mother never got out of high school, so they were not people of great political interest or insight.
Mm-hmm. So what did you have any teachers when you were growing up that shaped your interest in politics or your writing skills, actually?
Well, I had an excellent English teacher in the 10th grade who taught me everything there is to know about grammar and word usage, and that was a very valuable. It was not a lot of fun at the time, but it was a very valuable semester, and I treasure it.
So you go ahead.
And went to Ann Arbor High School, which was then such a good high school that if one was on the college preparatory program and got a C+ average, one was automatically admitted to the University of Michigan.
Oh, gee.
Yeah.
What world events occurred during your growing up years, and did any of them particularly impact you?
Well, the prolonged depression, prolonged and deep, that influenced everybody, and of course what was going on in Europe kind of passed us over, but it was not much talked about by history or social science teachers in high school. There was only one who really made much of it, which is rather surprising. And I was not especially interested. I was more interested in math and physics and drama.
Drama?
And rhetoric and that sort of thing than I was in politics or world events.
And where did you do your undergraduate work?
Well, I started at Oberlin and I graduated from Oberlin.
And what was your major?
I started as a math major, almost completed it, and then shifted to economics.
And what attracted you, what about economics attracted you?
Well, I thought I knew two things. One is I didn't want to have a career in which I taught. I didn't want to have a career in which I was expected to write. So I thought, well, economics would give me a variety of choices, from government to business. And then, of course, I went to graduate school at Columbia in economics, and I could see that I was not going to be a real economist. And if you're not attracted to a field enough to read beyond the requirements, just to read more because you're curious and you want to know more than is required in any given course, if that's not the case, then you're in the wrong field. So I finally began to ask myself, what did I really enjoy most in high school and in college? And the answer was English literature and political philosophy. So I audited a lot of English literature courses and loved it, but realized that I would never write a novel or a poem, and I would therefore be a critic, a very honorable profession, but it didn't inspire me. So political philosophy won, and I'm very pleased it did.
And any teachers that you had at Columbia or at Oberlin that pointed you in either of these two directions?
Well, in fact, the teacher and the wife of the teacher who influenced me most was John Lewis and his wife Ewart Lewis.
And they were at
they were at Oberlin.
Oberlin, yeah.
And I took just two half courses from John Lewis, one in theory and the other in American government. But I lived with the Lewises for a semester, and Ewart Lewis was a highly knowledgeable person in the field of medieval thought, and published a book, 1-volume version by Knopf and 2 volumes by Rutledge Keegan Paul called Medieval Political Ideas. And we had very interesting kitchen conversations about the interpretation of St. Augustine, for example. And I enjoyed all of that immensely. So when trying to make the final decision, my wife and I went back to Oberlin and visited the Lewises and talked about it. That confirmed what was by then a strong inclination, and I shifted from economics to political science.
Before we talk about your first book, what exactly does a political theorist do?
Thinks. Political theorists, I mean, well, there are two kinds of political theorists, really. One is a political theorist who writes about other people's political theories. And that, of course, in the traditional political theory field is what is done mostly. It's a reconsideration of Hobbes on this point or Locke on that point. And the other thing, if one wants to try to develop theory or promote its development, is to think about ways of doing that. And the first book was really a sorting out book. And the second book was an attempt to develop a theory of international politics in the sense in which it had not been developed, the second theory book, in a sense in which it had not been developed before.
Before we talk about those two books, help us understand, first, how does a person prepare to do theory? What kind of curriculum should one undergo to do that in a satisfactory way?
If you want to deal with theory as theory and not as the history of political philosophy, which incidentally is a part of the field that I love, and it's a marvelous literature, but I didn't feel inclined to rehash it. If one wants to develop theory, I think the direct route is to read a good deal of philosophy of science and take courses. Good courses are available in the philosophy of science. I mean, the first requirement, if you're going to work on a theory or the improvement of somebody else's theory, is to figure out what a theory is, which very few people seem to do. And I spent a lot of time reading the philosophy of science because it's a very difficult question. What is a theory? What can it do? What can it not do? How do you test its validity or seeming validity? It's a profound and difficult subject in its own right. It also is a field in which there's a great literature. And it was a pleasure for me to read in the philosophy of science and not to have to read a lot more political science.
Are you allowed to say that as a former president of the American Political
I do
Society?
say it. I do say it.
So what does a theory do?
A theory, first, in order to have a theory, you have to have a subject matter. You can't have a theory about everything. There's no such thing as a theory about everything. So you have to say, well, I'm going to try to develop a theory of, in this case, international politics. So the first question is, how can you think of international politics as a domain in its own right, as something that you could possibly have a theory about? Right?
And how do you decide that you can do that?
You have to figure out a way of defining it as an autonomous field of study. The closest comparison is the development of economic theory, where before the physiocrats, that is before roughly 1760, the economists wrote about all kinds of things, mainly at the level of bookkeeping, or what we might now call accounting, family and business accounts, that sort of thing. It was only with the physiocrats, who greatly influenced Adam Smith, that the concept of an economy is something that could be studied in its own right, developed. And once that concept existed, then it became at least possible to have a theory about how national economies work. Right? What regularities appear, what repetitions occur, how you can think of it as a self-sustaining enterprise. Right? And that the breakthrough was the physiocrats, and then, of course, the great follow-through was Adam Smith.
So if you're going to do theory of international politics, then at one level you probably have to be grounded in the history of the domain, so to speak.
You need to know. I don't see how you can do it without knowing a good deal of history. But the main thing is to have that conception of international politics as something that could be studied in its own right. It's something that, for example, to name two major figures in the field, Hans Morgenthau and Raymond Aron, Frenchman, thought was impossible. I mean, how can you isolate international politics, even for the purpose of study, from everything else that goes on? And their answer was you can't. And in that case, it's not possible to develop a theory of international politics. Because international politics is something that's influenced by everything else. National economy, national politics, international politics, and it's all just interrelated. There's no way of separating it. So the first requirement was to develop an idea of the structure of international politics, which would make it possible to think of international politics as a subject matter that could be studied in its own right. And that's what I did in theory of international politics.
Now, how does one then evaluate a theory? I've got to be, as a former student, I have to be careful here in the words that I use in asking you questions. But in other words, is usefulness a good way to evaluate a theory? And how do you know when a theory is useful?
Well, whether or not a theory is useful is really decided by the body of people who find it worthwhile to use the theory or to argue about the theory. As Steve Weinberg, who's a Nobel laureate in physics and a very reflective physicist, has said ultimately the test of a theory is that people, meaning the people in the field, find it worth dealing with, right? Arguing about, criticizing, trying to apply.
And the purpose of a theory is to explain what's going on, how the order hangs together. Clarify that for us.
Yeah. But what a theory does is present a mental picture of a part of the world. And in that picture are identified the major causal factors at work. And the theory specifies the relations among those, and the necessary relations, that is, they're necessary within the terms of the theory, right? Among those major causal forces, which we often now refer to as variables, right? Adopting a scientific terminology that's not always useful, but that's a simple way of putting it, right?
Yes.
And then you can compare that picture and the supposed causal forces at work with real world. And that's always a problematic exercise because the theory is very simple. What theories do is leave most everything out. I mean, you're simplifying, you're looking for what is really salient, what are the central propelling forces, right? And obviously they're not the only forces at work, so you've got that problem that natural scientists have too, but they can usually or often control for perturbations that come in from outside the system, right? Whereas in politics, generally, in international politics in particular, you can't do. Right? So it makes for endless argument and a lot of fun.
And the theory has an economy about it, because I mean, at one level you can say, well, there's so much going on in the world, let's put it all in the theory, but that's not the game here. In other words, there's not a one-to-one relationship. This is not an effort to replicate everything that's going on.
If it were, then the ideal theory would be identical with the real world, right? And instead, theory is a simple instrument which you hope to be able to use in order to understand and explain the real world. And the emphasis is on explanation, not on prediction. Prediction is nice if you can predict, fine. But the key requirement, if a theory is not able to explain what's going on, then it's not a theory, or it's a worthless theory, not a theory at all.
Well, has your work been influenced a lot by economic theory, or is it merely that you were a student of economics in an earlier phase of your life?
It's influenced very much by microeconomic theory. It really is built on a microeconomic theory label. That was, I would say, the major influence. And the second influence is anthropology, which I never studied, but wrote as formally as a student. But I read a great deal of anthropology, and the analogy is between segmentary lineage systems, or in Durkheim's terms, mechanical societies, rather than organic societies or solidary societies, and the analogy is quite close. Right?
Mm-hmm. Now, what about political scientists? Any teachers or intellectual influences that stand out, other than obviously the classical literature, which we'll talk about in a minute?
I never had. I mean, I had some very good professors in the field of international politics, but none of them were people who were attuned to theory in the sense in which I have been talking about it. Mm-hmm. Certainly, everybody dealt with those who were considered to be the major theoretically oriented people in the field, as we know from Thucydides onward.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your first book,
yeah.
Man, the State, and War. And there, the problem was what?
Well, the problem was very simple. For me, political theory was my major, and you had to have a second field, and I chose international politics because having worked in international economics, it gave me some kind of a start, but I was keeping it to a minimum. And there was a professor at Columbia at the time who was accustomed to making deals with people who were only minors in the field, that you could cover certain things and leave others aside. And we worked it out. I would do European diplomatic history, imperialism, and so on. I would not do international law and organization, which I never found attractive. And then he got sick. Mm-hmm. So he could not appear on the oral exams of people who were minors. The alternative was William T.R. Fox, so I went to see him and I explained this arrangement that I had made. And he said he had never heard of any such arrangement. So he called up the departmental secretary, who knew everybody and everything that was going on in the department, and she said, yes, Professor Peffer did customarily make such arrangements with minor students, right? And I can still remember this. Bill Fox, as I came to call him later, hung up, turned his chair toward me and said, nevertheless, if you're going to do international politics, you're going to do international politics. No, I had no choice. Well, I had completed my reading in that minor field, I thought, and was going to spend the remaining few weeks on my major interest, political theory. And instead, I spent those few weeks frantically reading as widely as possible. With my wife's help, she was getting books out of the library for me, in the field of international politics generally. And I could not make head or tail of it. It was the most confusing literature. And finally it came to me. I still have somewhere the yellow piece of paper on which I wrote this down. The reason these people are confusing is because they're thinking in different causal terms. And some are thinking that, well, the causes of what goes on in the world in international relations, the causes are rooted in human beings, what human beings are like, all right? And others are saying, well, the causes are found in states. Good states don't fight wars, democracy. Now the idea of the democratic peace. Good states don't fight wars, bad states fight wars. And then the definition of good and bad varies. For a Marxist, it's a socialist state is the good state. For a liberal, it's the democratic state. And so everything's rooted in what states are like. And then there's the third way of looking at it, that really at the international political level, that the causes are found. And although the causes do operate at those two other levels, they operate in this context, and the context is extremely important.
So, in summary, you called each of the you labeled each a different image. So, image 1 looks to the causes of war in the nature of man.
Right.
Image 2 looks at the causes of war in the nature of state, whether it's a democracy or a authoritarian or whatever.
Right.
But the third realm looks at international politics as a separate political domain or a separate domain.
Exactly.
So hence an opening really to begin looking for a theory, basically.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I remember people, specifically a professor at Oberlin, George Lani, saying to me, what's going to be the sequel to Man, the State, and War? And I said, I don't have an idea about how I could write a sequel. Mm-hmm. So from 1959 until the late 60s, I didn't have any sequel in mind, and then I began to think, I don't know, why do these things develop in one's mind? Who knows? Mm-hmm. I began to think of a way of, or ask myself at least the question of, how might a theory of international politics be possible? And that's when I began to read, and more widely in anthropology, and very widely in the philosophy of science, and I finally developed the notion, and it took a period of years to develop a notion and fill it out, figure out ways of presenting it effectively and so on. And then that's what one finds in the book Theory of International Politics.
And we'll talk about that in a minute, but I can't resist asking you something about Man, the State, and War, because it appears superficially that in one sense you're rejecting the first two images out of hand. But as I'm rereading it, I saw things differently, and I just want to be clear about this. You're saying in Man, the State, and the War that the underlying cause of war is the third image, whereas the first two images are immediate causes. So there is a continuing interplay between them, even though really the thrust of the analysis is toward the third image.
Exactly right.
Okay. Yep. So we can come back to those images later when we're talking about American policy in a minute. So you mentioned that you set about now to actually do a theory of international politics, and what did you conclude? Help us understand. Obviously, you could do a theory, but help us understand by talking a little about your theory. What is the nature of this realm of international politics?
It's the structure of the system the international political system is defined first by its organizing principle, which is anarchy. Mm-hmm. Some people would think of that as a disorganizing principle, but it's a principle that tells one how the major units of the realm relate to one another, right? And the relation is one of anarchy as opposed to hierarchy. It's not an ordered realm. It's not a law-bound realm. It's a realm in which the various units have to figure out for themselves how they're going to try to live with one another, and how they're going to pursue specifically, and ultimately how they're going to manage their own security worries in this anarchic realm, which is simply described as a realm of self-help. Mm-hmm. If you don't do it for yourself, you cannot count on anybody else doing it for you. They may help, they may not, but you don't know. You can't count on that. You're on your own. Right? And the second defining principle is by the distribution of capability among those units, right? With the more capable ones, of course, shaping the realm, posing the problems that the others have to deal with. And the analogy there, of course, is between international politics on the one hand and oligopolistic sectors of an economy on the other hand. Right? It's not a purely competitive realm. It's one in which the major actors, those of greater capability, set the scene in which the others must act.
Now, in layman's term, in terms of the first part of your analysis, what you're really saying is, look, there's no international police force, there's no real international court, and so therefore these things can't be adjudicated, and so that's really what you mean when you're trying to help us understand the organizing principle. So states have to act on their own.
Right.
They have to do it for themselves.
Right.
Now, the second part of this is really to say that the key understanding of the system comes from the way, the capability of one actor has vis-a-vis the others.
Right.
Okay. So what then helps us understand the outcomes in a particular situation in the world? Just these things, are these the things we have to look at to understand what's going on in the world?
Right. And the first one, of course, anarchy remains, and unless somehow a world government is ever developed, international politics will be an anarchic realm. So that's a variable that doesn't vary, if you want to use those terms. The second part of the definition is where one finds the variation. That is, we've known worlds historically, and of course we can also imagine them in the pure realm of theory, in which there are varying numbers of great powers. Always up until World War II in modern history, there were 5 or so great powers contending. World War II eventuated in a world in which there were only 2, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, in the states acting in those 2 different worlds face different kinds of problems. And it's interesting to recall the reflections that were made and the arguments that were conducted shortly after World War II. That is, the difficulty, for example, that previous great powers, countries like Great Britain and France, had coming to terms with the fact that they were no longer great powers, that they were reduced to the level of major powers. And the reduction directly affected their behavior. I mean, they had to adjust to a different kind of world that made a different kind of policy, different kinds of actions appropriate or inappropriate. Right? To use an old-fashioned terminology, they became not providers of their own security, but consumers of their own security. Now, some simple distinction like that explains a lot. It explains how Europe could develop as a somewhat distinct political realm. It no longer had, France no longer had to worry about a possible war with Germany, or as it had in preceding times, a possible war against Britain. Right. We worried about that. The Soviet Union worried about that. And there wasn't much they could do about it. I mean, they could make marginal differences in the system, but they could not provide for their own security vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Right? They had to rely on an outside power because the capabilities had shifted so much in that way. So whole new kinds of behavior become possible for the previous great powers because they're no longer great powers, just for that simple reason. And the United States assumes new responsibilities that it never dreamed of assuming. Right? In the 1930s, to tell an American that America would begin to take the responsibility for the security of major parts of the world would have been laughable. Nobody could even imagine such a condition existing. Right? But when the structure of international politics dramatically changed, we accommodated ourselves to that new condition.